Good evening. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sargis Sangari. I'm the Republican nominee in the 9th Congressional District of Illinois for U.S. Congress, and this is New Paradigms. I'm being joined again today for a continued conversation from last week with Susan Sweeney and also Charlene Foss. I introduced them last time, but this time I'm going to allow these two GOP front leads and all-stars to introduce themselves. Welcome to the show, Charlene and Susan.
Welcome.
Hi, Sargis. How are you this evening?
I'm outstanding. Charlene, go ahead. I want to make sure that the audience know a little bit about you and what work you do with the Illinois GOP, and same thing with you, Susan. Kind of get to understand your background.
Sure. I'm a lawyer and Susan's a teacher, and we're members of the Republican Party. We're titled, but essentially we're just volunteers. So I'm in elected office right now called a township committeeman. It's in Maine Township, which is in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. It includes quite a bit of the 9th Congressional District, where you're running Sargis, Park Ridge, Des Plaines, Niles, a little bit of Glenview, a little bit of Rosemont. And Susan is deputy committeeman, and she's also ran for the state legislator position in this area. I'm also on the state central committee for the state party, which again is just a fancy volunteer title. All of us work for the party in unpaid roles. So we do what we can with our families and with our friends and with volunteers to help our Republican candidates get elected.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because reality is that people believe that most of the individuals working for Illinois GOP are actually paid staff members, but actually these are volunteers that are taken away from their daily lives to be able to help get the Republicans to have a voice in Illinois politics itself. Susan, a little bit about you too, if possible.
I think Char pretty much covered it. I'm also a local trustee, so I too am in Maine Township, and we're very thrilled to support candidates such as yourself that are an alternative to the status quo, and we want to see change, whether it's at local or at the state level or for Congress, because we think Illinois is really in desperate need of new leadership, and that's what you bring to us, Sargis. So we're looking forward to continuing this New Paradigms with you and talking with you a little bit today about the issues.
Well, it's all about the new paradigms, right? There's a new perspective. So there's paradigm shifts that are taking place in our country, and a different way we can look at some of the changes that are taking place currently in the political discussions and discourse. I wanted to make sure that we at least covered some of the stuff that we left open last time to finish up our discussion. I know we left off on literally discussing what is happening with the riots, what are some of the new introductions from the legislator at the federal level. I know that the Democrats today came out and put their plan as to how they want to proceed, maybe possibly changing some of the issues with policing. So Char and Susan, tell me about what you guys are hearing from the GOP side, and what are some of the perspectives that the Illinois GOP has on these issues.
Right. Well, we continue to stand for equality and justice for all, no matter where, no matter who, all religions, races, creeds, and we want that equal application of law and everyone to feel safe in our country at all times. Of course, that's always been part of our platform, and it continues to be, and that message needs to be heard loud and clear now more than ever before. People are very upset about what happened in Minnesota. And of course, it's universal. What happened there was abhorrent. But what's interesting is the message has changed over the last several days. Of course, we and many people, rally for rights of African Americans. But the message now has converted into defund the police, which to me is not just a bridge too far. It's radical, it's dangerous, and we all know where that would lead. And what's even more upsetting is it's become part of the mainstream political discourse in the last few days too. We have at least one member of the Chicago City Council who's on board with this idea. We have seen a member of Congress, Ilhan Omar, who also supports this idea. And of course, there supposedly is a majority on the Minneapolis, Minnesota City Council. And I would like to hear your thoughts, Sargis, on what kind of world we would live in if there were no police or police weren't properly funded and they were to pull back, leaving a vacuum for, well, you know what kind of groups would take over safety in the community if that happened. And I know you've seen this throughout your military career, but I don't think people understand what the police's role is and why they sometimes need to be more than a social worker.
I mean, look, the police are more than a social worker. And they deal with a lot of issues at hand. Even me being an individual served in the military, just at leadership level, sometimes you're a military guy, sometimes you're a chaplain, sometimes you're a doctor, sometimes you're one of those social workers that has to give advice to your soldiers. Now take that and you're going to now see a police officer who's actually engaged in a domestic violence dispute, and you have to go there and try to do your best local policing to diffuse it without having to enforce some of the laws that are on the books. So I think the problem, there's two faults here, right? One is a policing issue that we talked about, and I have said in the past that if you want to get better trained police, then you have to maybe look at it from a federal level, not so much from a local level, because a lot of these police departments get their money from the federal government anyway. Now, the problem with the politician is the politician stands up there and says, we're going to defund the police. Guess what's going to happen? If you want to defund the police, you have to think through those steps, right? No decision's right or wrong decision, just a decision that has consequences. So if you defund the police, guess where those federal dollars are going to go? Because you're not going to change U.S. code. They're going to go to the sheriff's department. So that means the same individual who was a local police, whose the executive was in charge of them, in this case was the local mayor of a city, in this case Mayor Lightfoot, in charge of the Chicago Police Department, that individual would next day walk across the street and actually become part of the Cook County Sheriff. And the dollars will go there because you still have to have some kind of a policing to enforce the laws that the legislator passes, right, be at the federal, local level. When you do that, you're going to actually go opposite of what you want to do. You're talking about defunding him to make him weaker, but you're going to make him stronger, but you're going to make it a federal police structure. And if you make it a federal police structure, you're actually going against what you were trying to do in the first place. But a lot of people just throw out sound bites. They don't think through the process of what's about to happen. So based on their own words, they're going to push the, in this case, federal dollars into the sheriff department. You're going to push it to become more of a federal police structure. And when you do that, it's going to be harder for you to control it. That means the sheriff, who's an elected official, can actually send his deputies any place he wants. And by the way, a lot of people don't know, after the Reconstruction, when we fought the Civil War in the South, the sheriffs did use their deputy powers to deputize some of the individuals in the U.S. military to be used on certain operations for certain arrests. So that means that that sheriff can actually deputize some of those federal troops, and now you're injecting federal troops into area that maybe you didn't want to have them there. So you make it more complicated. But this is a reality when you have politicians who've been around for hundreds of years, I would say, combination, and they don't know what they're talking about. I was looking at a meme that was out there recently. It had a breakdown of just some of the leaders in the Democratic Party. It had Biden 44 years in office, Schumer 38, I believe. I have some of the numbers here. You had Pelosi for 32 years. You had Waters for 28 years, Nadler for 27 years, Schiff for 20 years, and Jan Schakowsky for 20 years, 20 plus years now, if she runs again. So I had a combined number of 219 years of being in legislative experience. Our country is only 243 years old, so literally 24 years is when they haven't been there, okay? The problem is not what has happened throughout the time that we've had these issues with policing. The problem is that these same individuals do not stage today and are proposing how to fix the problem. Well, you have a combined 219 years of problems that you cause for our nation, because you sat in your
Sargis,
seat as an incumbent.
what it
Go
seems
ahead.
to me, I mean, listening to you talk about, the number of years that we have these elected officials in office, are they really listening? Because what problem does it really solve to defund the police? And do people want it? I mean, when I look, it's the polling shows like 60% of the people don't want this. Just a few years ago, in the recent past, we've talked about expanding the police. I don't think the people in Chicago and in Illinois want that, to defund the police. So, you've got this effort behind you that's orchestrated by elected officials and incumbents that have been in office and Democrats for decades, as you've talked about. And I don't think they're really listening to the people and solving the problem that, we really need to solve here. And it's not answered.
Well, the reason we're here is because
it's creating
the
more
reason we're
chaos.
here because they didn't listen to the people to begin with. Look, how are you going to deal with the issues of Antifa? How are you going to deal with the issues of CHICOM, as we talked about last time, and we'll get into some of those right now, to look at what the Chinese Communist Party was doing during these protests. I know last week I talked about a personal story of the fact that we lost one of our commanders. The Assyrian Christian Army was fighting in Syria and Iraq to preserve the root of Christianity. One of our commanders was ambushed, killed, assassinated in 2015 by the Kurdish YPG, who are socialists, which Antifa was on the ground working with them at that time. And I think we may still have one of their photos out there of Antifa in Syria. If you have it out there, if you could put it up so we could go back to that one piece. Fred, are you there? Antifa Syria 1, if you could put that up, much appreciated. And this is a blog of one of their operators there. So these organizations are the reason why we have some of the issues we have today. You saw we were almost at the number of individuals that were shot and wounded in Chicago just recently. This was part of a turf war that I talked about in my other interviews, where I said, you're going to have the Latinos and the blacks fighting each other in the neighborhoods. Why? Because when you push the police to deal with the riot issues and the lootings, you pull them out of the areas where they had to deal with the drug problems, right? So what happened, you just saw how our crime rate increased. What's happening? The crime rate is really tied to the turf war on trying to bring drugs in. Who's bringing drugs in? Iran is pushing through the tri-borders area into the U.S. through open borders. You had the Honduran and Ecuadorians using the Mexican connections in these neighborhoods to try to expand their turf. Antifa has ties to these particular criminal organizations, because when you're running an insurgency, you're trying to make money, so you make it on drugs. Not only now you have these organizations that have caused this internal fighting, you have caused the government, police not being trusted by the individuals that they're supposed to serve as far as the information operation campaign is concerned. And all this is leading to more crime in the neighborhoods that they need policing. So look, the problem is, as long as you got folks that are calling for the disarming of the police, defunding of the police, you have individuals that are actually, as we showed last time, that there's money that was being given to support these coordinations. You have Black Lives Matter organization out there that has been hijacked by Antifa, which is actually literally coordinating where they needed to go. Finally, at least, we've had some crackdown. Finally, some individuals from the black community have come out and said, we don't want to be part of these organizations. That has pushed them out. But you see the GoFundMe site, I should say the sites here that are actually set up in order to get these agitators out of prison. And even the Biden campaign recently, as you saw in the most recent articles that came out, you had individuals from the Biden campaign that were giving money to be able to support the release of these individuals. You had lawyers that were actively, you see a copy of some of the law firms here that were working on behalf of these individuals who are really bad guys. Antifa itself has been designated as a domestic terror group. So when you have this organization by the government, Department of Justice, saying that they're a domestic terror group, and then you have lawyers working to get them out. We even had 2 lawyers that were in the riots throwing Molotov cocktail at the police in New York. It's very difficult. If you're not a country that is going to follow the law or believe in the law, you're going to get to where you are today. And I think if you have a chance, if you show me the piece on the Biden staff, just so we make sure we have the record of it that was released by Reuters, if you could please post that. And there you go. Here's at the core of
maybe 15, I think, of his staff members supposedly donated to get out of jail the people who were arrested. And we know that based on the volume of violence and looting that we had, they only rounded up some of the worst perpetrators. So to actually help the people who were at fault for all of it and were counterproductive to the Black Lives Matter campaign, and actually gave a bad name to people standing up for justice. Shame on them. And the other question I had for you, Sargis, is there still seems to be some confusion around Antifa. Oh, they're anti-fascists because they're calling themselves the opposite of what they probably stand for, from what we've seen. And people might think they are some radical leftists, and we keep calling them, and indeed President Trump calls them a domestic terrorist organization. But isn't it really international? I mean, from the photos you put up, I mean, I want to learn more about Antifa, because they're not just a lost group of radicals in this day and age that, you know, were radicalized on the web or all Americans. They actually are being taught in other countries, right? And there are other countries also seeding those organizations. And to me, that's most worrisome.
Well, other countries are supporting it. Look, and we're not going to get into a lot of the details of it, but Antifa is the like organization. I think last week we showed a video of an Antifa guy giving money to one of the locals in order to establish the to bring some natures in, purchase some things to be able to, you know, promote the violence that was taking place. Well, if he didn't have money, guess what? He wouldn't be out there, and nobody will listen to him. At the end of the day, if you got cash in your hand, people are going to listen to you. Antifa has money. Somebody's putting money in their pockets. They're not doing it because they're doing out of the free will of their cause. Antifa are what would be the modern KKK. The KKK was initially used to suppress black votes in the South. What did Antifa do? Antifa caused such a friction behind the civil rights movement that it makes it difficult for even in this type of climate to walk away from these friction points, Bill, to take the emotions out of it and approach the issues that really exist, to understand what is a daily basis of what a African American has to deal with in certain black neighborhoods, not all black neighborhoods. So later Antifa emerged from the from attempting to prevent wholesale of individuals from voting. So it's a street militia that uses violence to suppress free speech and votes, and it's fascist in itself. They're called anti-fascists in order to be able to market them. Whether it be the KKK, you could call it the black shirts, you could call it the brown shirts, the red pioneers, the communist use. BAM is a new name out there, or Antifa is all the same. Okay, there's no difference between these. And I'm glad that you talked about foreign money. We knew that last week we showed a picture of a young Chinese man who was actually pictured taking part in the Seattle looting. And if you have that picture, if you could put the picture from last week, please. No, this is the first one that you have, because this is the culmination of what we were going to be looking at. If you could bring me the other pictures, this was a young man, right? So what did I say? I said in civilian facial recognition, if you just put them through that process, you get a 40% match with these guys being part of CHICOM. If you could show me the other ones, follow-ons that we had when we followed this particular individual and looked at what were being posted on social media, this is a combination of everything else that you see. So this individual was inciting people to rob. And if you see him, you see his social picture, it has all the information, where even on the bottom, you can see what he's saying. He's saying that, it's part of a process, right? Destroying the economy of the U.S., you must understand, if you're also a patriot. And he's excited about the operations that he's conducting in support of who? Chairman Z. If you could show me the other pictures, if possible. There's his Twitter page. Again, next. That is him getting ready in his Twitter feed, getting ready to be able to conduct these type of operations. Next. Okay. So this individual itself is an individual that CHICOM would love to have. Why would they love to have? With everything that is happening right now in our country, with these individuals operating in support of the looting and the destruction, promoting the attacks against the police, what is happening in Hong Kong? And if we may, there's a video from Hong Kong that I would want you to be able to pay attention to. If you can put that up, please. And we'll talk through the process. And the importance of it, Shar and Susan, is because as we are dealing with these individuals inciting things, this is what is happening in Hong Kong. China wants to pass a new law in order to be able to suppress Hong Kong's ability to stay a separate system. So what are they doing? They're pulling out all the lawmakers that are going to vote against that law. They're pulling them out in order to make sure that they don't have a say before they pass the vote. This is how China cracks down. And China is doing this while we're too busy allowing individuals like this young man who are tied to CHICOM support looters and rioters under the concept that it's for George Floyd's death, under the concept that this is a civil rights issue. We have to understand that our country needs to look at things from a broader perspective, that it is nation powers too that are engaged in trying to get their will established across the globe, and in doing so, they're okay that we're beating up each other internally, and they're okay in order to be able to use these breaches, as we called in the military, or these chinks in our armor, to be able to ensure while we're fighting each other internally on issues that are relevant with these incumbents that have been sitting in, as I said, for 200 plus years, doing nothing in order to be able to finally be the global leader, both politically and economically, against us. And when that happens, it doesn't really matter if you want to defund the police or not. You are going to be beholden and a slave to other nations, and your democracy will falter across the board.
You know,
Well, how many steps away?
Democracy and what, you know, we've talked about before in the founding of our country. I mean, what we just saw on the screen and what we know to be our country are two different, worlds. And if you look back, like our founding fathers really allowed for the voice of dissent and in the minority. So what we can't do is silence. And we've had that happen in the media where people have not been able to speak up that may truly be representing the voice of maybe a silent majority. But unless we allow for the minority opinion and diversity and tolerance, diversity of ideas and thoughts, that, you know, we will lose our country. And if you look back to what like Benjamin Franklin had said, I think it was two wolves, that democracy, if we only had democracy and we didn't have a republic, democracy is two wolves and a lamb deciding what to eat for lunch. And liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. So we allow for the voice of dissent. And that's how people learn to understand and appreciate what our country really has to offer. It's
Well, I can offer
mob rule.
I couldn't agree more, and I can offer some concerns on that because the protecting the minority voice is always what's made us a great republic. Why we're not a democracy, as many mistake America to be, which would be mob rule, 51%. That's not how we do things here. And I fear we're getting farther away from that ideal when you look at some of the things that have happened this past week. So first we had Tom Cotton deplatformed by the New York Times. He published an op-ed and he worked intensely with the New York Times op-ed staff to fact check it and talk about what the issues were going to be, and it got published, and the staff of the New York Times disagreed with his viewpoint and lost their minds. So the op-ed was pulled down, and they said they're going to do better fact checking in the future. Hogwash. We also saw the Minneapolis mayor this weekend, who said that he would not defund the police when when he was demanded to answer yes or no during one of the protests in the city, and he was sent away shamefully. The swearing, yelling, screaming at him to get out by this protest, this BLM protest, where he had just explained that he was a broken man and wanted to work with them and wanted to make things better for them, but he wasn't willing to go as far as no law and order in the city. So he was sent out. I think that's pretty extreme. I mean, he's sent away out of his own city. And then we, of course, have the deplatforming on social media. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, all three of us have been victims of this. I know I first couldn't figure out what was going on when things I had posted on Facebook had just magically disappeared. And no one knew where they went. It was like they never existed. Which brings me to another issue, Sargis, that I would like to ask you about. As you know, Trump, about a week and a half ago, issued a new executive order. And it didn't have a lot of teeth. It basically called for new regulatory scheme on social media platforms. And up until now, they have had special privileges under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So essentially what Congress did was they took the Telecommunications Act, which is also known as, and they created a special exception to help the internet grow. And they said, you will be exempt from all of the laws and liabilities and rules that most utilities have to play by, as long as you are a neutral platform. You're just a utility. You're not creating content. So you're not liable for for anything you might say that's false. But now we know that too is a lie, because we've had Mark Zuckerberg openly admit that he's arguing at the same time that he's a neutral provider of information. He argues this all the time when in litigation with ISP providers, gateways and things like that. And he's not censoring any content, but he also now is arguing he is a content provider at the same time, and he can censor different content that's put on there by its users, which would make 230 a joke. And so Jack Dorsey, we see doing the same thing. He claims he doesn't optimize for neutrality, so he's admitted that. Columbia University has done a study saying that 95% of the time, the right-wing viewpoints are the ones that are suppressed. The EO doesn't go very far. It seems a lot of commenters have said it's legislation, and so it's Congress's job to edit that section and make these social media providers responsible for what they're doing under the act. And I don't know, Sargis, how you feel about that. I don't know that the EO changed anything. I don't know that Congress is going to do anything to upset big tech's oligarchy.
No, as long as those incumbents that are tied and get big tech money are in power, they're not going to touch it because they care about their seat, which is, if you look at their seats, most of the furniture they probably got probably says made in China on it anyway. So they're literally fighting to keep a Chinese created seat for themselves. Look, if today you get rid of your Facebook page. You completely go off grid. You change your cache. You get rid of the caches and delete all those cookies. Facebook will still track you. That's how they make money. They make money on you. So to say that these individuals can walk that line constantly is not going to work. Declaring utility and ends the conversation. But they want to be able to live in both worlds, right? Because it gives them the flexibility. Yeah.
Right, and that they own our data because we agreed to the terms and conditions. And of course, we don't have GDPR or CCPA like they do in California, like they do in Europe. We don't have the right to be forgotten. But what's really outrageous is I think we all can recognize that these social media platforms are engaging in censorship. They are engaging in political conduct. So they don't have the right to have a liability shield under Section 230 anymore. Their market power and the amount of money that they extract from the ads that they sell and the other, the data that they collect and sell, it's past time. And I wish the DOJ could do something about this. So if Facebook says, yeah, we want it both ways, it should be split up, in my view.
Look, the only way you're going to be able to change is... the only way you could change is get folks like me into Congress. They're going to go in and say, no, that's not going to happen. But again, this is why they're going to give money to the incumbent here, rather than give it to me, because they know that I would make sure that they abide by those laws as a utility, and it would set everything right. Look, the problem we have is, as you know, President Trump says, the fake media sometimes. You mentioned Senator Cotton recently. Senator Cotton wrote an op-ed. That op-ed that he wrote was an op-ed. It's just to drive a way of thinking about things, to start a conversation, to get rid of the editor for that. And then the same newspaper is the one that is publishing an op-ed from the Taliban. Come on. When we had our first new paradigms discussion on June 1st, and we were talking about Antifa, I had a capture from the Washington Post. If you could put that up, so you see even the press media and how they're approaching these things. You got Antifa that the Department of Justice is going after as being a local terrorist organization. And what is the Washington Post doing? If you could please put this up, so we could show the screenshot. This individual right here is Mark Bray. Mark Bray is it says in his byline, historian of human rights, terrorism and political radicalism in modern Europe and Rutgers University. He is the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. So the guy who wrote the Antifa Handbook is saying to us on regular media, newsprint, that Antifa is not the problem. Trump's bluster is a distraction from police violence. Okay, so here's a guy who wrote the book for the individuals that are considered a terrorist group, and they get FaceTime on Washington Post. Colonel Sangari is not going to get a FaceTime on Washington Post. Lieutenant Colonel Sangari is, and after I served 20 years in the U.S. military. And then you got New York Times, where you got Senator Cotton, who's an elected official. Well, it doesn't matter what his party is, and he writes an op-ed, and you remove him because you change the title, and frankly, it doesn't even meet the journalistic requirements of what a title should look like. I wouldn't let anybody pass that as a title on the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement, let alone on New York Times. And New York Times, though, turns around and publishes an op-ed from the Taliban, who've killed American soldiers. And then now you got these individuals on social media that are suppressing our content. Forbes magazine had published an article. I think you have a capture on that, if you could put it up. Forbes magazine had published an article that looked at the Wuhan virus, the Chinese virus, or CCP virus, I should say, not the Chinese virus. I stand corrected on that one. And it talked about the fact that there's a property that had been found within the protein structure that says that it's possible that this is not something you find in nature. So it goes back to the P4 lab. Now, if you go to my article, the article that I wrote it in early February on the Wuhan virus. And I wrote that article specifically in early February. I tried to post it on our local newspapers here. For a month, I had to go through numerous edits. I got to the 12th edit finally. At least the editor for our local newspaper was kind enough to say, this is going to be very difficult for us to be able to publish it. Is it possible maybe for you to take it to other mediums? And I took it to Japan Forward. Why? Because Japan was about to go through this process. So 3 April, I wrote it, and that article itself, the Forbes article, really clears these problems and clears them in support of and identifies that what I had written in that article is actually has other evidence that are validating it. Now, with that said, Forbes took it down right away as soon as they put it up. Now, I don't know if they have gone back while we're having discussion and place it back up again in Forbes, but Forbes took it down. We cannot live in a nation where the press media is controlled by one party, and it doesn't allow diversity of ideas. And if that one party gets compromised, folks, you're going to have problems. You're going to really have problems in this nation, in this country, and we are going to be where we are today.
Well, there's a lot of blue checks on Twitter out there that have no problem repeating CCP propaganda. It happens all the time. And I did hear a proposal that I think it was Facebook, or maybe it was one of the others, was talking about maybe flagging something that they suspected was CCP propaganda in the future. Because as you know, one post and several major headlines have turned out to be wrong. We just had one last week with the wrong job reports number. Oops, I don't know how you figure that out wrong. It's one objective number. But things like that, they catch fire, they surface to the top as most popular, and then you can't get rid of them, or you can't erase the impression once given, even though it's false. And we've seen stats on the Russia hoax theory. Rodenstein's testimony made it pretty clear what we already knew. Got very little attention last week when he testified. And was he still testifying this week? I'm not sure. But there's so many Americans that still believe in this Russian hoax theory, although it's been disproven now in multiple reports. That's the power of fake news. I don't believe in censorship, but I think we have to decide if we're going to have it one way or the other. We can't have unchecked censorship, or we should let it all hang out. One or the other.
Look, I think if you look at it, it's really about how our country is organized, right? How our country kind of looks at things, and it's part of our character, right? If you think about it, in our country, we have a belief that everything is God-given. So that means God gave us everything. We have to use everything to our ability for us as best as possible. So what we do, as a simple example, we go out there, we create a car, right? The car can drive 270 miles an hour. Then we create a freeway, and this freeway is free. You could drive on it as fast as you want. But then we go and hire a local politician. We elect them, put them in their position, or the machine does in the case of Illinois. And then they pass a law that say you cannot drive more than 65 miles an hour on this particular road. Then we hire the police officers, we give them the tools and the training to enforce that law, to ensure that they limit our ability of driving the so-called car that we built that can go faster than what the speed limit allows. And then we're always in this fight. We fight our own government to say, why are you suppressing me? Well, I'm suppressing you because you passed a law. You elected the individual to pass a law to suppress you, whether it be on social media, whether it be what happens with police training, whether it be what happens with economic restructuring. All this is done through what? Through those elected officials, right? That we have chosen to put those limitations on us. And what happens when they're incumbents and they sit in their seat for 20 plus years to a point where they die in their seats and they're replaced by family members? This is what you're going to get. You're going to get chaos across the board. Look, the only way I could explain it in many of the correspondences that we had between the founding fathers, as well as the founding documents for our nation, it was really clear that the United States was not only a nation that was based on personal liberties, but it was also a nation that was based on personal responsibility. And while liberties and freedoms are important, we have seen in the last century and a half that that some of us have taken the lead away from the responsibility, and the responsibility in this case has been put on the reserve. At least from a guy who served in the military, that's how I've seen it. That's how a lot of my colleagues have seen it. So personal responsibility is what provides meaning to our life and our lives, and we cultivate ourselves with the various forms of knowledge to be able to help as much as we can. First, as far as our freedoms are concerned, we to pursue an art or a craft, and in that capacity, some of us, like me, joined the military with the freedom to choose the MOSs we wanted to be in. We've used those skills to solidify our families, to make sure that at least we're able to support and build a strong base for it. And if we can, from there, we reach out, try to support our communities. And from there, if you have the ability, we try to help our region or nation. In this process, we have to balance this, right? Is it the personal responsibility, or is it just individual freedoms, and how do we go about it? So this discussion, which is always going to be at clash with itself, is part of the fabric of America. And I think with peaceful protests, we could have some discussions that you wouldn't have. But I think at the end of the day, is a choice that the Americans have to make. Which way do we want to head?
Right, and when we made that policy choice as a nation, where we guarantee individual rights, and we believe in liberty, and we believe in personal responsibility, the assumption was that this country, had a Judeo-Christian tradition, although we're welcoming of all religions, but that we were a people that believed in God, believed in right or wrong, because there was something bigger and more important to us, something that helped us make good choices and keep us in check as a people. And when we lose that, then these other systems kind of fall away. So it just makes me wonder if there's more than one system under attack here.
It's a system of systems. You have to have individuals in Congress that understand systems of systems, and the clash between federal system and how we want to be, more state rights, more federal ability to affect certain laws and requirements, and we're always going to be in this kind of a turmoil. But if you understand it, if your goal is to help your nation overall achieve what it wants to, which is to be a better nation in the long run and much more productive nation on the global stage, then you'll be fine. If you keep on doing what you're doing to yourself currently, in these little fights, China, Russia, Iran, none of those people are waiting for you to get your act together. They're moving forward with the clear intent of replacing you on the global stage.
Sure. So I wanted to ask you, Sargis. Oh, go ahead, Susan.
Oh, go. You can go, Cheryl. I'll go after that. It's fine.
I just remembered it's Sargis's birthday, on June 4th. I'm about 4 days late, but Susan brought to my attention this was also the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. And I wondered, well, happy birthday, Sargis, but what a horrible
Thank you
coincidence.
very much.
And I know that probably weighs pretty heavy on your heart when your birthday rolls around every year. And since we've talked so much about China and the horrible regime those people live under, I'm sure you can draw lessons from that.
Well, there's a lot of lessons, or a lot of dates fall in. George Floyd's memorial fell on my birthday too. The Tiananmen Square is on my birthday, so there's certain dates that are etched in my thinking constantly that are very important for me, especially as I work towards being in Congress, and ensure that on those dates I remember those specific topics and issues that have to be legislated to support our nation. It is a reality of what happened in Tiananmen Square. The Chinese will use a heavy hand. They will kill their own citizens in order to gain a powerful position for themselves. I hope we don't get to a point where we lose our ability to be Americans. We don't lose our rights to be what inherently makes us Americans, which is the Constitution of the United States, the preamble, of the United States. They're at the heart of what really drives every American, I think, and everybody who comes to this country who wants to limit freedom. And I hope we just don't lose it.
Amen.
And, thinking about that and your freeway analogy and allowing for what we have in this country with success and focusing on, there's a lot of groups that are working toward solving the problems that we've been recently faced with. And let's not forget that only a couple of months ago, we had some incredible success to celebrate. And that was that we had the lowest Black and Latino unemployment in the history of our country. And that we were providing opportunity zones in those areas. And that we had criminal justice reform. And we had, better opportunity for housing. We had less people on food stamps. So here we were building up opportunities in our country for minorities and Blacks, the very thing that we want to see progress on. And it seems like we fell back after COVID and then with what happened and that horrible situation into this divide, which I think there's something else behind it, because we understand peaceful protest. We understand the frustration. We all do. We understand what's wrong with murder. And that's where we have agreement. Let's go back and look at what we can do with policies that make differences in people's lives. And we know we can do that. And we need good elected officials to bring that about, to support the America First agenda. So I guess to that end, I'm looking at some of the things that they're doing in education in the 1619 group project. And then the alternative to that is the 1776. I'm going to read what the purpose of that is. That's the Woodson Center that's doing that now, Sargis. And it's an assembly of independent voices who uphold our country's authentic founding virtues and values and challenge those who assert America is forever defined by its past failures, such as slavery. We seek to offer alternative perspectives that celebrate the progress America has made on delivering its promise of equality and opportunity and highlight the resilience of its people. Our focus is on solving problems, and I think that's what we need to do, solve problems. We don't solve problems with defunding police and creating more chaos. We allow the minority voice to be heard. We allow for people to participate and peacefully protest, but we have to solve our problems. And I think there's some really great Black leaders that you will see within the Woodson Center. And I think those voices need to be heard, and we don't need dissent, to not hear those voices. So
yeah, look, I mean, like just World Bank itself just came out, said that our GDP will fall back by 7% for this year. Maybe we'll have a growth at 3% for next year, but a lot of it gains by the minorities, especially the high employment rates for African Americans or Latinos was wiped out. For what? So that individuals can go burn businesses in the Black community, and how that didn't resolve any of your problems. Look, I tell the Black community, the African American community all the time that you got to understand, you're not going to have a say until you're at the table, okay? And at the table, I'm not saying that, with these type of social movements that you have or organizations. If you think about it, Black Lives Matter was painted on the ground in Washington, D.C. Okay, what happened after you painted that? Law didn't change, or your economically didn't change. Nothing happened. These are outlets that are given to you to distract you from how you have to approach actually making genuine changes. And I think the biggest thing is, if the African American community understands, one, Colonel Sangari is running. As I tell the Black community, I'm running for office. I'm gonna be a better representative for you than a woman who's been sitting there for 20 plus years, okay? Whose husband ran some of the organizations that had individuals there, whether it be from Occupy Wall Street or Antifa. These individuals who went through these circles that actually worked in those organizations. These individuals are not going to represent you. As I just told you earlier in the program, you have 200 plus years of incompetency sitting in Congress, and these people today presented a plan of how to fix a problem. that you had to deal with because you dealt with those problems under their leadership. Now, you vote me in, I'll represent you. But at the end of the day, as I tell the Black community, you got to get your folks to the table. You got to get those quality African American capable to understand what is happening within the structure of the United States individually in those neighborhoods that are mostly affected, to be able to be at the table to have a say. And that means run for Congress, run for Senate, run for presidency. Because frankly, anything outside of that doesn't write the bills, doesn't cash the checks. And if you're going to have organizations, you gotta weed out all these bad actors out of the organizations. What do I mean by that? What happened as soon as we finally started pointing out that you cannot have Antifa and Black Lives Matter walking down this corridor together, Antifa starts getting targeted by the FBI, who went after them recently, and I believe 2 of their members were just caught in Texas, and now are on the outskirts, and now you have peaceful protests. The peaceful protests at least have a much better opportunity of addressing some of the issues than you had with the looting and the violence. But it really gave a negative perspective when it comes to race relations. It really muddled the waters. It brought passions in to this discussion that should not have been there for us to systematically address the issues of bad policing. So that's just a reality of what we have to deal with on a constant basis. And I hope that finally the African American community comes to the senses and uses the right platforms to be able to finally change the laws that have been affecting him all these years.
That's great advice. Now, how do you think this whole movement compares to the civil rights movement that we saw in the 60s and 70s? I wonder just for your historical perspective on that.
Look, I think the best way to do it is if you look at it from, let's look at 1963. And I was recently asked this question on another broadcast. In 1963, Phillip Randolph, who was the lead for the first March on Washington, which was organized by Bear Rustin at that time, another key civil rights leader, as well as we all know that that whole process led to the speech march, ended with Martin Luther King delivering his "I Have a Dream" speech. It's Lincoln Memorial that was defaced during the riots. But before we got there, what did the civil rights leaders do? In this case, in case of Randolph, if you go back to 1925, he organized and led the first African American labor union in the United States. Looked at early civil rights movements and also the labor movement specifically. He's a key to how to establish a civil rights movement because, if you think about it, he was one of those key leaders that from the beginning he became successful because he had stated that if we were going to do the March on Washington, we needed to create a coalition to help the mass demonstrations in order to force initially the government to end segregation. Now, however, if you go back and think about how he approached everything, his initial focus was to end it in the military and also in the defense industry. Those were the areas where he could reach out and touch at the time. So he allied himself with who? He allied himself with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is a NAACP, the Federation Council on Negro Affairs, and then the United National Labor, the National Urban League. All the groups that he chose were moderate civil rights organizations that wanted to first establish order internally and then push for a change. He used individuals inside of the government, outside of the government. One of them is Mary Bethune, who was at that time the head of the federal counsel on Negro affairs, and was a Washington insider that had unprecedented access to the Roosevelts. She was a very good friend, and she was actually a paid government official within the administration. Bethune and the Eleanor Roosevelt were close friends. This meant that Bethune had received insider information and knowledge and information on how the president's thoughts were and what his beliefs were in advocating for blacks. And she had an individual who was a friend directly tied to the president that could advocate on those issues. Walter White was the head of the NAACP at that time, and White was also another Washington insider and had several meetings on the so-called topics of desegregation in the defense industry. You see, you're inside the government. You're getting the picture. You're able to actually have these discussions internal in the government, not in the public eyes. In the later years, I think Randolph and White were arguing about who actually, pushed the president to write the executive order, and at that time it was Executive Order 8802, which was signed in June of 41. To prohibit the federal government from using race as a discrimination issue when it came to the defense industry. Ultimately, though, if you think about it, both of these individuals influenced Roosevelt. White was an individual who pressured from the inside, and then at that time, Randolph is an individual who pressures from the House side of the White House. But the goal was to work in conjunction together as the black community within the systems of the U.S. government to be able to affect it. What made them successful was that in their processes, guess what they did? They said no to the communists. They pushed the communists out. They didn't want to have them. The anti-war protesters, Reverend Martin Luther King said, "I don't want to have them in our process, in our discourse when it comes to civil rights," because he knew that these different groups were going to be agitators. They were not going to be representing the black community. They had other interests. Antifa has other interests. These other organizations like Antifa have other interests. And a lot of the push by the civil rights leaders was that even at that time, we don't want to have money from liberal whites, because their interests are opposite our interests, and they don't understand what we're dealing with on a daily basis. They don't have the black experience that's going to drive them to be able to be representatives for us. These civil rights leaders worked within the system. They ran a peaceful protest, and look where we ended up in the 60s when it came down to civil rights. Look where we are today. We are where we are today because a lot of these organizations that are supposed to have learned from what was happening and how the approach was from these civil rights leaders have lost the entire focus on how to build upon what their successes were. And a lot of the organizations get hijacked, and you end up with looting being your representative. And that's not the way to do it. I think that if you exclude some of these organizations from your internal dynamics, I think you'll be much better served, and you have to work both from the inside and outside of the government structures to be able to influence the changes that you want. I know that's a little bit long-winded, but I hope that kind of gives you the answer that would be my advice and has been my advice to the various different organizations in the Black community.
Great advice, Sargis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sargis.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm going to thank the listeners. I know we're right on the hour again. I want to thank everybody for being here and listening. We are going to be back again next Monday with new guests, but I'm going to thank Charlene and Susan for their best as far as being here and supporting me. And again, hopefully we see you guys on stage on November 3rd in an election win. If you do support and like to help us, volunteer, or even be able to support us financially is very important. Please go to votesangari.com, and we need all the help we can. We're under stress. We're a few months away from the election date, and we need all the help we can get to the finish line and hopefully be able to represent the people of the 9th Congressional District of Illinois.
Thank you, Sargis.
Thank you, Sargis.
Thank you, ladies.
Bye-bye.
There are many whites who are trying to solve the problem, but you never see them going under the label of liberals. That white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere. He's the most deceitful. He's like a fox, and a fox is always more dangerous in the forest than the wolf. You can see the wolf coming. You know what he's up to, but the fox will fool you. He comes at you with his mouth shaped in such a way that even though you see his teeth, you think he's smiling. You take him for a friend.
There are many whites who act friendly toward Negroes. A fox acts friendly toward the lamb. And usually the fox is the one who ends up with the lamb chop on his plate. The wolf doesn't act friendly, and therefore the wolf has more difficulty in getting the lamb chop in his plate.
I'd like to point out, though, that...
And I say that because it is usually if you study the structure of the Negro community, economically, politically, civically, psychologically, and otherwise, it's controlled by the white liberal, who usually poses as the friend of the Negro.
on the other hand, I think one could point to a large number of whites who have struggled for civil rights,
Give me an
for
example.
equality, and have got little or nothing out of it, other than quite a few bruises.
Give me an example.
Well, the large number of white students who have gone into the South, for example, working for SNCC and other organizations.
Not working for SNCC or other organizations, but working for the white political machines who benefit by the voting efforts of Negroes.
Okay. Today, you could point to a large number of Negro leaders who have consistently betrayed Negroes in a whole host of areas.
They aren't really Negro leaders. These are puppets that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. These are parrots that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. You can't name me a Negro leader who has been betrayed Negroes, who has not been endorsed, sanctioned, subsidized, and supported by the white liberals.